The year was 1763, and the nation of France was just beginning to catch its breath. The 7 Years' War, a global conflict that had pitted the Kingdom of Great Britain against the Kingdom of France and their respective allies, had finally come to an end. The Treaty of Paris, signed on February 10th of that year, brought a tentative peace to the European continent and its far-flung colonies. In the rural regions of southern France, particularly in the rugged and beautiful province of Languedoc, the end of the war was met with a mixture of relief and trepidation. For years, the farmers, shepherds, and villagers of this land had borne the brunt of wartime taxation, their meager earnings stripped away to fund the king's armies and navies. Now, with peace restored, they hoped for a return to normalcy, a chance to rebuild their lives and tend to their flocks without the constant specter of conflict looming over them. Little did they know that a far more insidious and terrifying threat was about to emerge from the shadows of their forests and mountains. A beast so fearsome, so cunning, and so relentless that it would come to be known as one of the most infamous cryptids in history. A creature that would leave an indelible mark on the annals of French history and the human psyche for centuries to come. This is the story of the Beast of Gévaudan, a tale of terror, mystery, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of an incomprehensible evil. The provincial town of Mendy, nestled in the heart of the Gévaudan region, now part of the modern-day department of Lozère, was bustling with activity on a warm spring morning in 1764. The weekly market was in full swing, with farmers and artisans from the surrounding countryside bringing their wares to sell. The air was thick with the mingled scents of fresh bread, ripe cheese, and fragrant herbs. Among the crowd, a young shepherdess named Marie-Jeanne Vallée made her way through the throng, her keen eyes scanning the stalls for the supplies she needed. At 17, Marie-Jeanne was known throughout the region for her skill with a staff and her courage in the face of danger. She had grown up in these hills, learning the ways of the land from her father and older brothers. As she haggled over the price of a new pair of sturdy boots, Marie-Jeanne overheard a conversation between two elderly men that made her pause. "Did you hear about Jean Boulet's daughter?" one of them asked, his voice low and worried. The other man shook his head. "No, what happened?" "Found dead she was, just outside their farm near the forest of Mercoire. They say it was a wolf attack, but—" The man trailed off, his eyes darting around as if afraid of being overheard. Marie-Jeanne felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm day. Wolf attacks were not unheard of in these parts, but they were rare, especially so close to populated areas. She made a mental note to be extra vigilant when tending her flock in the coming days. The death of Jean Boulet's daughter, later identified as 14-year-old Jeanne Boulet, marked the beginning of a reign of terror that would grip the Gévaudan region for years to come. On June 30th, 1764, Jeanne's mutilated body was discovered just outside her family's farm, near the edge of the forest of Mercoire. The details of the attack were horrific. Jeanne's chest had been savagely torn open, her heart seemingly consumed by whatever beast had fallen upon her. The local authorities, accustomed to dealing with occasional wolf attacks, were stunned by the brutality of the assault. This was no ordinary predator. News of Jeanne's death spread quickly through the nearby villages and hamlets. Farmers began to keep their children closer to home, and shepherds took to carrying extra weapons when tending their flocks. But these precautions would prove woefully inadequate in the face of what was to come. Barely a week after Jeanne's death, another victim was claimed. 16-year-old Catherine Vidal was found barely clinging to life near the village of Saint-Étienne-de-Lugdare. Before succumbing to her grievous injuries, Catherine managed to gasp out a description of her attacker that would haunt the dreams of every person in Gévaudan. A beast, like a wolf, but not huge, red eyes. God help us all. Catherine's last words sparked a flurry of speculation and fear. Was this the same creature that had killed Jeanne Boulet? And if so, what manner of beast could it be? The local priests began to whisper of divine punishment. while others spoke in hushed tones of werewolves and other supernatural horrors. As summer turned to autumn, the attacks continued with horrifying regularity. Men, women, and children fell victim to the mysterious predator, their bodies found in various states of mutilation. A pattern began to emerge. The beast seemed to prefer women and children, often attacking them while they were alone or in small groups, tending to livestock or traveling between villages. The fear that gripped the region was palpable. Farmers began to band together, forming armed patrols to protect their communities. Children were forbidden from wandering alone, and even the bravest hunters thought twice before venturing into the forests after dark. Marie-Jeanne Vallée, the young shepherdess from Monde, found herself thrust into the center of this maelstrom of terror. Her skill with a staff and her intimate knowledge of the local terrain made her a valuable asset to the impromptu militia that had formed to protect the region's flocks and families. One crisp October morning, as Marie-Jeanne led her sheep to pasture, she had her first encounter with the beast that would change her life forever. The fog lay thick in the valleys, and an eerie silence had fallen over the landscape. Suddenly, Marie-Jeanne heard a sound that made her blood run cold, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Gripping her staff tightly, Marie-Jeanne slowly turned, her eyes scanning the mist-shrouded rocks and trees around her. For a moment she saw nothing. Then, like a nightmare made flesh, a massive shape emerged from the fog barely 20 paces away. The creature before her defied description. It was wolf-like in form, but far larger than any wolf Marie-Jeanne had ever seen or heard of. Its fur was a mottled reddish-brown, with a distinctive black stripe running along its back. But it was the beast's eyes that truly struck terror into Marie-Jeanne's heart. They gleamed with an almost human intelligence, filled with a malevolence that seemed to pierce her very soul. For what felt like an eternity, girl and beast stood frozen, locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, with a speed that belied its enormous size, the creature lunged forward. Marie-Jeanne's training took over, and she swung her staff with all her might, catching the beast across its muzzle with a resounding crack. The beast let out a sound that was half growl, half laugh, a chilling noise that would haunt Marie-Jeanne's dreams for years to come. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature melted back into the fog, leaving Marie-Jeanne trembling and surrounded by her terrified, bleating sheep. As she hurried back to the village to raise the alarm, Marie-Jeanne knew that her life and the lives of everyone in Gévaudan would never be the same. The beast of Gévaudan had made its presence known, and the true horror was only beginning. News of the attacks in Gévaudan soon reached the court of King Louis XV in Versailles. At first, the reports were dismissed as exaggerations or the product of rural superstition. But as the body count continued to rise and the descriptions of the beast grew more detailed and consistent, the king was forced to take notice. Louis XV, known as Louis the Beloved in the early years of his reign, was facing mounting criticism for his governance and personal conduct. The 7 Years' War had been a disaster for France, resulting in the loss of most of its overseas territories and plunging the kingdom into debt. The king saw in the Beast of Gévaudan an opportunity to regain some of his lost popularity by coming to the aid of his beleaguered subjects. In the autumn of 1764, Louis XV issued a royal proclamation declaring that the beast must be hunted down and killed. He promised a substantial reward for its capture or death, and began assembling a team of the kingdom's most renowned hunters and trackers. The first to be dispatched was Jean-Baptiste Duhamel, a seasoned dragoon captain with a reputation for bravery and cunning. Duhamel arrived in Gévaudan with a company of skilled soldiers and a pack of specially trained hunting dogs. The locals greeted him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. While they were grateful for the crown's intervention, many doubted that these city-bred soldiers could match wits with the beast that had eluded them for so long. Duhamel's campaign got off to a promising start. He organized large-scale hunts, mobilizing hundreds of local men to serve as beaters, driving the beast towards his sharpshooters. But time and again the creature managed to slip through their nets, leaving behind only fleeting glimpses and a trail of mutilated livestock. As weeks turned to months with no success, frustration began to mount. Duhamel's tactics grew increasingly desperate and reckless. He ordered the poisoning of animal carcasses, hoping to bait the beast, but succeeded only in killing dozens of local dogs and wolves. His soldiers, unaccustomed to the harsh terrain and bitter cold of the Gévaudan winter, began to fall ill and lose morale. The locals, too, were losing faith in Duhamel's abilities. Rumors began to circulate that the beast was more than just an animal, that it was a werewolf, a demon, or even a punishment sent by God. Some whispered that it could make itself invisible or change its shape at will. In the face of such supernatural speculation, Duhamel's conventional military tactics seemed woefully inadequate. One person who never lost hope was Marie-Jeanne Vallée. Her encounter with the beast had left her shaken but determined. She began to spend every spare moment honing her skills with staff and sling, and studying the habits of wolves and other predators. Marie-Jeanne was convinced that the key to defeating the beast lay in understanding it, not just hunting it. As Duhamel's campaign faltered, Marie-Jeanne took it upon herself to organize the local shepherds and farmers into a more effective defense force. She taught them techniques for protecting their flocks and families, and how to recognize the signs of the beast's presence. Her courage and resourcefulness did not go unnoticed, and soon, La Pucelle de Gévaudan, the Maid of Gévaudan, became a symbol of hope for the beleaguered region. But even Marie-Jeanne's efforts could not stem the tide of death that continued to sweep across Gévaudan. By the spring of 1765, nearly a year after the first attacks, the beast had claimed over 60 lives, with scores more injured. The failure of Duhamel's expedition was a severe embarrassment for the crown, and Louis XV knew he needed a new strategy. The king turned to his personal gun-bearer, François Antoine, a man renowned throughout Europe for his hunting prowess. Antoine, though in his 70s, was eager to take on the challenge that had defeated so many others. He arrived in Gévaudan in June 1765, accompanied by his nephew and a small team of experienced hunters. Antoine's approach was markedly different from Duhamel's. Rather than relying on large-scale drives, he focused on careful tracking and ambush tactics. He spent weeks studying the beast's hunting patterns and interviewing survivors of its attacks. Slowly but surely, Antoine began to close in on his quarry. The climax came on September 20th, 1765, near the Abbey of Chazes. Antoine and his team had been tracking a large wolf for days, following its trail through the rugged terrain. As they crested a hill, they came face to face with an enormous gray wolf, larger than any they had ever seen. Antoine raised his gun and fired. The beast went down, but not before letting out a bone-chilling howl that echoed through the valleys. As Antoine approached the fallen creature, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The wolf was undoubtedly large. It weighed over 60 kilograms, but it didn't match the descriptions of the reddish-brown monster that had terrorized Gévaudan for so long. Nevertheless, Antoine had his prize. The wolf, soon dubbed the Wolf of Chazes, was sent to Versailles to be stuffed and displayed as a trophy. Antoine was hailed as a hero, and Louis XV was quick to declare the crisis over. The beast, the king proclaimed, had been slain, and the people of Gévaudan could rest easy. But Marie-Jeanne Vallée and many of the locals were not convinced. The wolf Antoine had killed was impressive, certainly, but it wasn't the creature that had looked into Marie-Jeanne's eyes with such terrible intelligence. And as the celebrations died down and autumn once again gave way to winter, a familiar dread began to settle over the countryside. The beast of Gévaudan, it seemed, was not done with them yet. The winter of 1765 to 1766 passed in an uneasy calm. The people of Gévaudan, buoyed by the official declaration that the beast had been slain, began to return to their normal routines. Children once again played in the fields, and shepherds let their guards down as they tended their flocks. But Marie-Jeanne Vallée remained vigilant. She couldn't shake the feeling that the true threat still lurked in the shadows, biding its time. Her fears were tragically confirmed on a cold morning in early March 1766. A young boy named Pierre Ramade, barely 8 years old, was found dead on the outskirts of the village of Rocles. His body bore the now familiar marks of the beast-savage claw marks, a torn throat, and partially consumed flesh. The fragile peace that had settled over Gévaudan was shattered in an instant. As news of Pierre's death spread, panic gripped the region once again. The beast, it seemed, had returned with a vengeance. In the weeks that followed, a fresh wave of attacks swept across the countryside. The pattern was familiar. Women and children were the primary targets, often attacked while alone or in small groups. The renewed onslaught threw the French court into chaos. Louis XV, who had so proudly declared the crisis over, now faced ridicule and accusations of incompetence. His ministers scrambled to come up with a new strategy to deal with the threat, but confidence in the government's ability to protect its citizens had been severely shaken. In Gévaudan itself, a sense of grim determination settled over the populace. They had survived the beast's first reign of terror, and they were determined to do so again. Local militias were reformed, this time with a focus on constant vigilance rather than large-scale hunts. Marie-Jeanne Vallée found herself thrust into a leadership role. Her previous encounter with the beast and her tireless efforts to protect her community had earned her the respect of even the most skeptical villagers. She began organizing regular patrols and training sessions, teaching others the skills she had honed over the past year. One of Marie-Jeanne's most innovative contributions was the development of a new type of weapon specifically designed to combat the beast. Working with local blacksmiths, she helped create a modified version of the traditional shepherd's staff, reinforced with metal bands and tipped with a sharp detachable spear point. This weapon, which came to be known as the Vallée pike, allowed its wielder to keep the beast at bay while still having the option to deliver a killing blow. As spring turned to summer, the attacks continued, but with less frequency than before. It seemed that the beast, wary perhaps of the increased vigilance of its would-be prey, had become more cautious. But this lull only served to heighten the sense of dread that hung over Gévaudan. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every distant howl sent hearts racing. The French government, desperate to resolve the crisis once and for all, began to entertain increasingly outlandish theories about the nature of the beast. Some claimed it was a hybrid creature, perhaps the result of a wolf breeding with a large dog. Others suggested it might be an exotic animal escaped from a private menagerie, perhaps a hyena or even a lion. As these theories circulated, they only added to the mystique and terror surrounding the beast. In the autumn of 1766, a new figure arrived in Gévaudan, one who would play a crucial role in the final chapter of the beast's reign of terror. Jean Chastel, a local farmer and skilled huntsman, had been away serving in the army when the attacks first began. Upon his return, he was horrified to learn of the devastation that had befallen his homeland. Chastel was a man of deep religious conviction, and he became convinced that the beast was not merely an animal, but a manifestation of evil itself. He began to spend long hours in prayer, asking for divine guidance in his quest to rid Gévaudan of this scourge. As winter approached, Chastel claimed to have received a vision instructing him on how to defeat the beast. He melted down a collection of silver medals blessed by a local priest and used them to cast a set of bullets. These, he declared, would be the key to slaying the creature once and for all. Many dismissed Chastel's claims as the ravings of a madman, but Marie-Jeanne Vallée saw in him a kindred spirit, someone whose determination to end the beast's reign matched her own. The two formed an unlikely alliance, combining Marie-Jeanne's practical knowledge of the terrain and tracking skills with Chastel's mystical approach. The winter of 1766 to 1767 was one of the harshest in living memory. Heavy snows blanketed the countryside, making travel between villages nearly impossible. The beast seemed to thrive in these conditions, growing bolder in its attacks as its prey struggled through the deep drifts. It was during this time that Marie-Jeanne had her second encounter with the creature. She was returning from a neighboring village late one evening, having delivered supplies to a family trapped by the snow. As she made her way along a narrow path cut through a deep snowbank, she heard the now familiar growl behind her. Turning slowly, Marie-Jeanne found herself once again face to face with the beast. It stood barely 10 paces away, its red eyes gleaming in the fading light. But this time, Marie-Jeanne was prepared. She hefted her valet pike, its metal tip glinting. For a long moment, girl and beast stood motionless, sizing each other up. Then, with a snarl, the creature leapt. Marie-Jeanne reacted with lightning speed, bringing her pike up in a swift arc. The beast, with inhuman agility, twisted in mid-air, avoiding the brunt of the blow, but still receiving a long gash along its flank. Landing heavily in the snow, the beast turned to face Marie-Jeanne once more. Blood matted its fur where the pike had struck, but the wound seemed to have only enraged it further. It circled warily, looking for an opening. Marie-Jeanne knew she couldn't outlast the creature in a prolonged fight. Her only hope was to wound it severely enough to drive it off. As the beast tensed for another lunge, she feinted with her pike, then quickly reversed her grip, driving the butt end of the staff into the snow at her feet. The beast, committed to its attack, couldn't change course in time. It impaled itself on the pike's sharp tip, letting out a terrible howl of pain and fury. But even this grievous injury wasn't enough to stop it. With a powerful twist of its body, the beast wrenched itself free of the weapon, taking a chunk of the metal tip with it as it fled into the gathering darkness. Marie-Jeanne, breathing heavily and hardly daring to believe she had survived, made her way back to the village as quickly as she could. The news of her encounter spread rapidly, reigniting hope that the beast could be defeated. The winter slowly gave way to spring, and with the thawing snows came a renewed determination to end the beast's reign of terror once and for all. Jean Chastel, armed with his silver bullets and an unwavering faith, joined forces with a group of local hunters led by the Marquis d'Apcher, a nobleman who had taken a personal interest in slaying the beast. On June 19, 1767, their opportunity finally came. The hunting party had spread out across the slopes of Montmouchet, a rugged peak that had long been suspected as one of the beast's lairs. Marie-Jeanne, despite protests from some of the men, insisted on joining the hunt. Her expertise in tracking and her previous encounters with the beast made her an invaluable asset. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the mountainside, a shout went up from one of the hunters. The beast had been spotted, moving swiftly through a dense thicket of pines. The hunters converged on the area, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. It was Jean Chastel who found himself face to face with the creature. He had paused to read from his Bible and offer a prayer when the beast emerged from the undergrowth barely 20 paces away. With a steady hand, Chastel raised his gun and fired, the blessed silver bullet finding its mark. The beast let out a terrible, almost human cry as it fell. The other hunters, including Marie-Jeanne, rushed to the scene. What they found both confirmed their worst fears and defied explanation. The creature was indeed massive, far larger than any wolf they had ever seen. Its fur was a mottled reddish-brown, with the distinctive black stripe along its back that had been reported by so many witnesses. But there were other features that set it apart from any known animal. Its jaws were unnaturally large, filled with teeth that seemed too numerous and too sharp for a normal wolf. Its paws were enormous, with claws that looked more like a bear's than a canine's. Most disturbing of all were its eyes. Even in death they seemed to gleam with an unnatural intelligence, an almost human awareness that sent chills down the spines of all who looked upon them. As the initial shock wore off, the hunters set about the grim task of examining the beast's body. An impromptu autopsy was performed on the spot, revealing even more anomalies. The creature's skeletal structure was unlike anything the hunters had ever seen, with joints that seemed designed for both quadrupedal and bipedal movement. Its musculature was incredibly dense, explaining its legendary strength and speed. But perhaps the most startling discovery was found in the beast's stomach contents. Among the partially digested remains of its last meals, the hunters found scraps of clothing and several small objects that could only have come from human victims. This grisly evidence confirmed beyond any doubt that they had indeed slain the monster responsible for the reign of terror in Gavaudan. As word of the beast's death spread, a wave of relief and jubilation swept across the region. Celebrations broke out in every village and town, with church bells ringing out in triumphant peals. The long nightmare that had gripped Gévaudan for 3 years was finally over. The body of the beast was carefully preserved and sent to Versailles for examination by the king's own naturalists. But somewhere along the journey, the specimen mysteriously disappeared. Some claimed it had been stolen by those who feared what a closer examination might reveal. Others whispered that the beast itself was not truly dead, that it had somehow regenerated and escaped. In the years that followed, the legend of the beast of Gavaudan only grew. Books were written, songs were composed, and countless theories were put forth about the true nature of the creature. Was it a wolf, a hyena, some unknown species? Or was it, as some continued to insist, a supernatural entity? For Marie-Jeanne Vallée, the end of the beast's reign brought both relief and a strange sense of loss. She had dedicated so much of herself to the fight against the creature that its absence left a void in her life. But she soon found new purpose in helping her community rebuild and recover from the years of terror. Jean Chastel, hailed as a hero for delivering the killing shot, became something of a local celebrity. He maintained until his dying day that it was his faith, as much as his silver bullet, that had allowed him to vanquish the beast. The Marquis d'Apcher used his influence to ensure that the story of the beast of Gavaudan was not forgotten. He commissioned a detailed account of the events, preserving the testimonies of survivors and hunters alike for future generations. As the years turned to decades and decades to centuries, the tale of the beast of Gavaudan became firmly entrenched in French folklore. It inspired countless works of art, literature, and film, each offering its own interpretation of the events that had transpired in those remote mountains. Today, more than 250 years after the beast's reign of terror, the mystery continues to captivate the imagination of people around the world. The region of Gavaudan, now part of the department of Lozère, has embraced its dark history, with museums and tours dedicated to the legend of the beast. Historians and cryptozoologists continue to debate the true nature of the creature that terrorized the French countryside for those 3 fateful years. Was it merely an exceptionally large wolf, or perhaps a pack of wolves working in concert? Could it have been some unknown species, a remnant of a prehistoric era? Or was there some truth to the more fantastical theories of werewolves and supernatural beings? Whatever the truth may be, the legacy of the beast of Gavaudan endures. It serves as a reminder of the terror that can grip a community in the face of the unknown, and of the courage and resilience of those who stand against such threats. The story of Marie-Jeanne Vallée, Jean Chastel, and all those who fought against the beast continues to inspire and intrigue, a testament to the enduring power of legend and the human spirit's capacity to face even the most terrifying of adversities. As long as there are shadows in the forests and howls in the night, the memory of the beast of Gavaudan will live on, a chilling reminder that sometimes the line between myth and reality is far thinner than we might like to believe. The trouble with hindsight is that it makes fools of us all. Looking back now, every warning sign seems so obvious. The weather reports, the ranger's hesitation, even that peculiar twist in my gut when we first turned onto the unmarked gravel road. But on that humid August afternoon in 2023, My husband Michael and I were too caught up in our grand western adventure to heed any of them. I was 32 then, Michael 34, and we'd been married just under 2 years. Like many East Coast transplants, we'd moved to Phoenix for my job in tech, and the Arizona wilderness still held that mystical allure of the unknown. This camping trip was meant to be our big initiation into Western outdoor life. Our chance to prove we weren't just city slickers playing at being adventurers. The campsite I'd chosen was deep in the Tonto National Forest, perched on what the online reviews called Eagle's Rest Overlook. It was a primitive spot, no facilities, requiring a 20-mile drive down increasingly rough Forest Service roads. The photos showed sweeping views across the Mogollon Rim, with pine forests stretching endlessly toward the horizon. What they didn't show was how isolated it would feel when things went wrong. We stopped at the ranger station on our way in, a small wooden building that had seen better days. The ranger, a weathered woman in her 50s, frowned at our destination. "Eagle's Rest?" She tapped her pen against the desk. "There's a storm system moving in tonight. Might want to consider one of our developed campgrounds instead." But I'd spent weeks planning this trip, researching the perfect spot, and I wasn't about to let a little weather derail us. "We've got good gear," I assured her. "Rainproof tent, emergency supplies. We'll be fine." She shrugged, but her eyes held something I'd later recognize as concern. "Your call. Just stay away from the cliff edge if the storm hits. Ground gets unstable up there when it's wet." We signed the registration book. I noticed only 6 other names entered for that area, and headed out. The gravel road grew progressively worse as we climbed, our SUV bouncing over ruts and washboards. Michael gripped the steering wheel tighter with each mile. "Some road," he muttered, swerving around a basketball-sized rock. "You sure about this place?" I checked my phone. No signal, as expected. "It'll be worth it for the view. Besides, how bad can a summer storm be?" The answer to that question would come sooner than we expected, and it would be far worse than either of us imagined. But for now, we were still in that blissful state of ignorance that precedes all true horror stories. We were still convinced that the worst thing we'd face would be a wet tent and some muddy clothes. We reached the camping area around 4 p.m. The overlook lived up to its name, a flat stretch of pine-studded earth that ended abruptly in a cliff face dropping several hundred feet to the valley below. The view was breathtaking, all right, but there was something unsettling about how the ground just disappeared into empty air. 3 other vehicles were parked in the clearing, a mud-splattered pickup truck, and 2 SUVs clustered around a pair of tents. As we pulled in, 4 men emerged from around a portable camping table. They looked to be in their mid-20s, the kind of local outdoorsmen who probably knew these mountains like their own backyards. The tallest one, wearing a Phoenix Suns cap, raised his hand in greeting. "You folks here for the night?" Michael nodded, already pulling our tent from the trunk. "That's the plan. Unless this storm we keep hearing about is really going to be something." The men exchanged glances. "Nah," Suns Cap said, but something in his tone didn't match his casual words. "These summer storms, they make a lot of noise, but it's mostly just show. We've camped here dozens of times." While Michael chatted with them, I surveyed our potential campsite options. That's when I spotted the other campers, 2 women setting up a tent about 100 yards away, near the tree line. One was walking a large German shepherd that watched us with alert interest. Following proper camping etiquette, we chose a spot that gave everyone decent privacy while staying within shouting distance. As we worked on the tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the 4 men. They were too quiet for a group their size, and they kept looking toward the cliff edge, then at their phones, then at each other. "Did those guys seem weird to you?" I asked Michael as we hammered in the last tent stake. He shrugged, but I could tell he'd noticed it too. Maybe they're just worried about the weather. The sky was already darkening, not just with approaching night, but with clouds that seemed to be building up from all directions. The wind had picked up too, making the pine branches creak and sway above us. We decided to skip the sunset photos I'd planned and instead secure everything for the coming storm. That's when we heard it, the first distant rumble of thunder rolling across the mountains like a warning drum. The German shepherd started barking, sharp and insistent, until one of the women called it inside their tent. Looking back, I realized that was the moment when we should have left. The dog knew something wasn't right. Animals always know. But we were too invested, too proud, too convinced of our ability to handle whatever nature threw at us. We had no way of knowing that nature would be the least of our concerns that night. By 9 p.m., the storm had become impossible to ignore. Wind howled through the pines with a sound like screaming, and lightning turned the clouds into stuttering purple-white photographs of hell. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees, and something that might have been rain or sleet hammered against our tent with machine gun intensity. Michael and I lay in our sleeping bags, pretending to be more comfortable than we were. The tent shuddered with each gust, and despite our careful waterproofing, a fine mist of moisture seemed to hang in the air inside. "Some camping trip, huh?" Michael tried to joke, but his voice was tight with tension. I checked my phone again. Still no signal, and now the battery was down to 60%. We'd turned it off earlier to conserve power for emergencies, but what constituted an emergency? The weather? The growing sense of unease? The way the four men had gone completely silent in their tents, when earlier they'd been talking and laughing? At 10:30, I woke from a fitful doze to a sound that made my blood run cold. Not thunder this time, but something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. A scratching noise like fingernails on fabric, moving slowly down the side of our tent. "Michael," I whispered, reaching for his hand. But he was already awake, his body rigid beside me. The scratching continued, followed by a heavy impact that made the tent wall bulge inward. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps in the mud outside. They didn't sound like an animal. Animals don't walk with that kind of measured purpose. I held my breath, counting the steps. 1, 2, 3. They circled the tent, pausing at each corner. When they reached the side where my head was, they stopped. There was a moment of absolute stillness, broken only by the storm and my thundering heartbeat. Then came the sigh, a deep human sigh, just inches from where I lay. Michael's whispered, "What's wrong?" shattered the moment, and the footsteps retreated quickly into the night. We lay there, barely breathing, straining to hear over the storm, but whoever or whatever had been out there was gone. It was probably just one of the other campers checking their tent lines, Michael suggested, but we both knew that wasn't true. No one checks tent lines by walking that slowly, that deliberately, or by stopping to sigh outside someone else's tent. The rest of that hour passed in a blur of paranoid hypervigilance. Every sound became a potential threat. Every shadow cast by lightning might have been a figure standing outside. The wind took on voices, whispering words we couldn't quite make out. The temperature continued to drop, and soon the rain turned to sleet, then snow, an impossibility in August, even at this elevation. The impacts on our tent grew heavier, more frequent. Each one made us flinch, imagining hands or weapons instead of falling ice. Around midnight, the tent ceiling began to sag under the accumulating weight. Michael reached up to push it away, and we heard that familiar sliding sound we'd been hearing all night. But this time we knew it wasn't someone touching our tent. It was ice falling off in sheets. That should have been reassuring. It explained some of the strange noises, at least. But somehow knowing that one mystery was solved only made the others more terrifying. Because if the scratching sounds and footsteps weren't ice, what were they? We kept a small LED lantern on, its weak light barely penetrating the darkness. Every few minutes, more ice would slide off the tent with a sound like something being dragged away. The wind had become a constant scream, punctuated by thunder that seemed to shake the very mountain. And then at 3 a.m., everything changed. "What the hell?" "Oh my God, what the hell?" The woman's scream cut through the storm like a knife, high-pitched and desperate. It came from the direction of the tree line, where the two women had set up their tent. I fumbled to turn off our light as Michael sat up, his breath coming in short gasps. We listened, frozen, as the screaming continued. "No, no, 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 no!" The words dissolved into unintelligible sounds of terror, followed by the roar of an engine starting. Tires spun in mud and gravel. A vehicle's headlights swept across our tent as it accelerated away, the engine sound fading into the storm. Then silence, broken only by the endless rain and wind. "We have to do something," I whispered, but neither of us moved. The darkness outside our tent suddenly seemed alive with possibilities, none of them good. "Check the other camps first," Michael said finally. "The guys with the truck?" I peered through a gap in the tent flap. Lightning flashed, illuminating the clearing. The four men's tents were still there, but their vehicles were gone. They'd left in such a hurry they'd abandoned their camping gear. That's when we heard it, that measured, deliberate walking sound again. But this time it wasn't circling our tent. It was moving from the tree line toward the cliff edge, accompanied by a dragging noise. Michael reached for the car keys. "We're leaving, now." We grabbed only what we could reach: phones, wallets, keys. The tent could stay. Everything else could stay. We just needed to get to the car without being seen. I called 911 as soon as we were inside, but the connection was terrible. I managed to convey our location and something about screaming, but the dispatcher's voice kept breaking up. She said they'd send someone, but it would take at least an hour to reach us. We didn't wait. Michael started the engine, keeping the lights off until we were moving. As we turned around, lightning flashed again, and I saw something that still haunts my nightmares. A figure standing at the cliff edge, and behind it something long and pale being dragged through the mud. The police report made everything sound so clean, so orderly. 2 abandoned camping sites discovered. Signs of struggle near the tree line. No bodies found despite an extensive search of the area and the cliff base. The 4 men were identified as local residents, all with clean records. Their tents contained nothing suspicious. The 2 women were never identified. They'd paid cash at the ranger station and used false names in the registration book. But here's what the report doesn't mention: the deep scratches found on the inside of their tent, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. The single dog collar, found halfway between the tent and the cliff edge. The cell phone discovered in the mud, its screen cracked but still showing an unsent text message. "They're not from here." I've spent months trying to piece together what happened that night. The police have theories: domestic violence, drug deal gone wrong, tragic accident in the storm. But they didn't hear that sigh outside our tent. They didn't hear the methodical footsteps, or the way that woman screamed. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind blows just right, I think I can still hear her voice. "What the hell? Oh my God, what the hell?" As if she'd seen something her mind couldn't process. Something that didn't belong on that mountain, or maybe anywhere in our world. Michael and I don't camp anymore. We've moved back east, where the mountains are older and somehow less secretive. But I still check the Arizona news regularly, searching for any mention of Eagle's Rest Overlook. Last week I found something. The Forest Service has quietly closed that section of the mountain. The official reason is erosion control, but I know better. Because the article mentioned one detail that sent ice through my veins. In the past year, 3 more campers have vanished from that area, all during storms, all at night. And all of them reported hearing footsteps just before they disappeared. There's one detail I've never told anyone, not even Michael. Something I saw in that final lightning flash as we drove away. The figure at the cliff edge, it was roughly human-shaped, yes, but its proportions were wrong somehow. Its arms were too long, its neck too fluid in its movement. And when the lightning struck again, illuminating the clearing one last time, I could have sworn it turned to watch us leave. Not with eyes exactly, but with something that reflected the light like polished bone. I don't know what happened on that mountain. I don't know if what we encountered was human evil or something else entirely. But I do know this. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some mysteries should remain in the darkness where they belong, because the truth might be worse than anything we can imagine. And somewhere in the Tonto National Forest, on a lonely overlook where the wind never stops howling, something is still walking through the storms, circling tents with slow, deliberate steps, waiting for the next group of campers who think they're prepared for whatever the night might bring. They're not. None of us were. And if you ever find yourself on a mountain during a storm, and you hear footsteps approaching your tent, don't ask what's making them. Just run. To understand my story, you need to know something about trespassing laws in our country. We don't really have any, as long as you're respectful and non-destructive. You can walk over any hills you like, and in my case, camp on any beach of your choosing. The only rule is that when you leave, the area should be exactly as you found it. This freedom to roam has been part of our culture for generations, though sometimes I wonder if it makes us too trusting. I used to love camping when I was little. Our family would go multiple times a year, joining a large group of my parents' friends and their kids. On average, there were maybe 10 of us at a time, which presented quite a logistical challenge since we always headed out to this one really remote beach on the coast. A 3-mile stretch of pristine sand, backed by towering cliffs that glowed orange at sunset. We weren't the only ones who knew about this spot. There were always yachts bobbing just off the shore, their lights twinkling in the darkness, and other campers dotting the beach with their colorful tents. Most of them also had children or teenagers, so it wasn't really a wild party scene. It was very much an informal family holiday spot, the kind of place where kids would form instant friendships over sandcastles and adults would share coffee and stories around morning campfires. There was even a small building with toilets and showers installed nearby, which seemed strange given how remote the location was. I guess the local council must have figured it out and gotten sick of people using the dunes as their personal bathroom. The facility wasn't much, just a concrete block with basic amenities, but it was better than nothing. We took a trip up in spring 2011. I'm usually terrible with dates, but this one stands out because I had gotten my dog in winter 2010. I remember the exact moment I first saw her at the shelter that November, a birthday gift from me to me. I paid her adoption fee with money I'd saved up from my summer job at the local library. Let me tell you about Parmesan. She came to me as a 6-month-old puppy who had been rescued from a dogfighting situation. The shelter workers told me she had never been used in fights. She was too young, but she had witnessed enough violence to leave its mark. When I first met her, she was curled up in the corner of her kennel, watching everyone with wary eyes. But when I sat down next to her cage and started reading aloud from the book I'd brought, a habit from my library job, she slowly inched closer until her nose was pressed against the chain-link fence. You're not entirely sure what breed she is, but my best guess is a Lurcher-Staffy mix. She has the lean build of a lurcher with the broad chest and powerful jaw of a staffy. Her fur is a mix of brindle and white, with one ear that never quite stands up straight. She is a wonderfully well-tempered dog with people and most other dogs, but you absolutely do not threaten her. She'll have you. I learned this early on when a drunk man tried to grab my arm outside our house. Parmesan placed herself between us and growled so deeply, the man stumbled backward and fell over his own feet trying to get away. By the time of this camping trip, I'd had Parmesan for a few months. She'd never come camping with us before, but in our family, dogs are just as much family members as humans. So when we all piled into our old Volvo station wagon, she came too. Unusually, though, none of the family friends could make it. So it was only me, my sister, my dad, and my mom. But I didn't mind. I wasn't that attached to the other kids anyway. I'd rather play with my dog, and I'd still have my sister to talk to. The drive took the better part of 6 hours. We left later than usual. I remember now it was because my dad had insisted on finishing some work project before we left, typical of him to put work before family time. The sun was already setting by the time we turned onto the coastal road, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and orange. I remember pressing my face against the window, watching the colors reflect off the ocean while Parmesan dozed with her head in my lap. We expected to arrive to find other campers already set up, the beach illuminated by campfires like it always was. But when we pulled up to our usual spot, the beach was empty. No tents, no cars, no bobbing lights from boats offshore. Just an endless stretch of sand and the sound of waves crashing against the shore. The emptiness should have been our first warning sign. In all our years of coming here, I'd never seen the beach completely deserted, not even in bad weather. And the weather that night was perfect, warm for spring, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. Despite the unusual emptiness, my parents started unloading the car and attempting to set up the tent in the failing light. They asked us to fetch some of the lighter bags from the boot while they wrestled with the tent poles. I rolled down the window of the car for Parmesan before getting out, because it was pretty hot for that time of year. The old Volvo had manual windows, the kind you had to crank, and I left it open just enough for her to get some air while still being secure. Fumbling about in the dark on a beach in the middle of nowhere is pretty spooky, even when you're used to camping. The one road that led to this beach was circular, crossing over a bridge above a tidal inlet, meaning you could basically circle around the beach like a big oval shape if you really felt like it. The bridge itself was an old concrete structure, probably built in the 1960s, with rust-stained supports and a low guardrail that always made my mom nervous. After maybe 15 minutes of my dad trying to nail the tent pegs into the sand and swearing under his breath every time they pulled loose, my mom's voice cut through the darkness. "Have you seen that car drive around? It's been passed a few times now." My dad kind of shrugged her off, like he always did when she expressed concern about something. He's sort of like that, dismissive of other people's worries until they become his worries. I don't know if he said anything back to her, but I remembered seeing headlights sweep across the beach several times while we were setting up. At the time, I'd assumed it was different cars, maybe other campers looking for a spot. Now I wonder if I was being naive. After a few more minutes, a car pulled up next to ours on the road. The engine cut off, but the headlights stayed on, creating long shadows that stretched across the sand. Someone got out, slamming the door hard enough to make me jump. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet from the cars to where we were, and the light was pretty low except for our torches. We weren't expecting to see anyone else out here at this point. I think my mom said it must be security, though I don't know why a random beach would have security. I think what she meant was the Wildlife Trust, as they do occasionally come down to do their checks on the protected dune grass and nesting birds. But something about the way the person was moving set off alarm bells in my head. The guy was walking pretty unevenly, with that distinctive stagger that you can't quite hide when you're seriously intoxicated. There was absolutely no way this guy was sober. Cool, a junkie. Not an unusual find in our area, but it's rare to see them this far from town. Most stick to the urban areas where they can more easily find what they need. As he walked into flashlight range, we realized he was carrying a large knife, at least 15 inches, though I was smaller then, so maybe my sense of scale was off. But I remember thinking it looked more like a machete than a regular knife. The blade caught the light from our torches, and I could see dark stains on it that I tried very hard not to think about. I don't like my dad much. He's always been more focused on his work than his family, and he's got a temper that makes everyone walk on eggshells. But credit to him, once he saw the knife, he got up immediately. He was still holding the camping mallet, and he put himself between the man and the rest of us. My mom grabbed my sister and me, pulling us close to her. The man began to shout wildly at us that we couldn't camp here. that he was just letting us know. His words were slurred, running together, and his free hand kept twitching at his side. My dad tried to be low-key with him at first, telling him that was fine, that we'd leave, but this didn't work. The man kept coming closer, weaving slightly but still moving with purpose. That's when my dad started shouting back, his voice echoing off the cliffs behind us. The man matched his volume, screaming incoherently about territory and warnings and consequences. My sister and I were crying. I remember shaking so hard my teeth were chattering, even though the night was warm. I was utterly terrified, as I'm sure anyone would be in that situation. It really did seem like this guy and my dad were going to fight, and I'm going to be honest, I didn't fancy my dad's chances. The man was younger, bigger, and had a weapon that could do serious damage. While it's grim to consider, I'm absolutely convinced that he would have killed my dad and possibly us as well. My mother, bless her, probably wouldn't have run with us. She's always put her relationship with Dad above everything else, including our safety sometimes. But this isn't how it went down. Almost like a wolf, Parmesan proved herself to be the apex predator in this situation. None of us had noticed her getting out of the car. She must have managed to push the partially open window down further with her paws. The first we knew of her presence was a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She got him good by the arm, the one holding the knife. Her jaws clamped down hard, ripping through his jacket and shredding the skin underneath. I could hear the wet sound of tissue tearing, and the man's scream of rage turned to one of pain. He dropped the knife as Parmesan's teeth found purchase in his flesh. The man fought back hard. He kicked her, punched her with his free hand, but Parmesan held on like her life. Our lives depended on it. Eventually he managed to get her off, but the damage was done. He grabbed the knife from where it had fallen in the sand and ran back to his car, leaving a trail of blood drops that gleamed black in the torchlight. Parmesan didn't follow him. She came back to us, positioning herself between our family and the road, her hackles still raised and a low growl rumbling in her chest. We could hear the man cursing and crying out in pain as he started his car and drove away, the engine roaring as he accelerated hard enough to spray gravel. As quickly as we could, we gathered our scattered camping gear and threw it into the car. We were all shaking, running on pure adrenaline. Before getting in, I looked Parmesan over carefully. She was okay, no cuts or serious injuries, just some bruising that would show up later. The car's window was much more open than I'd left it, confirming our theory about how she'd escaped. We think what happened was when the shouting started, she must have put her paws up on the gap I had left for her. It was an old car with manual windows, and the mechanism was worn enough that a determined dog could probably force it down. We think she must have been able to hit it with her paws to force it down enough to squeeze out. I've never been so grateful for faulty car parts in my life. This isn't the end of the story, though. We were all pretty scared, and since we had Parmesan with us, we couldn't book a hotel for the night. Most places in our area have strict no-pet policies. My parents decided to just drive home so we could all feel safe, but first we had to drive into the nearest town for gas. The fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and we had a long drive ahead of us. I spent the drive into town trying to clean Parmesan up a little bit. There was some blood on her muzzle, but it wasn't hers. I'd always loved dogs, but what she'd just done for us blew my mind. She'd put herself in harm's way without hesitation to protect us. As I wiped her clean with some tissues, she kept looking at the windows, growling softly whenever a car passed us going the other way. As we drove into town, we came across a gas station, but it looked closed. The lights were off except for a single security light casting harsh shadows across the empty forecourt. My dad drove up closer to get a better look and stuck his head out of the window, trying to see the hours posted on the door. My mom asked him what on earth he was doing, and he told her he was trying to see when it opens. That's when my heart sank. Parked in the corner behind a van, so we hadn't seen him at first, was the man with the knife. He was sitting on the hood of his car, using some tissue paper to clean up his arm. Even from a distance, I could see how bad it was. Parmesan had done some serious damage. The man looked up as our headlights swept across him, and even though I couldn't see his face clearly, I knew he recognized our car. Without stopping to refuel or look anywhere else in town, my dad drove right out of there. He decided to go to the next town over, but this situation soon changed when we realized it was 60 miles away. We didn't have enough gas for that. The gauge was already showing less than a quarter tank, and our old Volvo was notorious for being fuel hungry. Dad said it would be fine. We had triple the coverage. They'd come tow us, or at least get us somewhere safe for the night. Better than staying in the last town. After driving for maybe 5 minutes, lights flashed up from behind. Another car. It was the same car that the man had been driving, and he was following us. He must have realized that we were low on gas. The next half hour was one of the worst of my life. I had a complete and utter breakdown, as did everyone really. I could tell my parents were trying to keep it together so it wouldn't upset us more, but we weren't really little kids. We were both in double digits at least, and we knew how dangerous the situation was. My dad turned off the radio and all the interior lights, trying to save every drop of fuel. The man followed us for 50 miles before he finally peeled away onto another road. Our fuel meter was on the big red E for empty for the last 10 miles. We were driving on fumes practically. I don't really believe in God, but if he does exist, that was definitely one of his miracles. We managed to find a gas station that was still open, one of those 24-hour places attached to a truck stop. We filled to a full tank before driving the rest of the way home. My sister and I slept in the car after that, exhausted from fear and adrenaline. I only woke up once when we stopped at a red light, and I remember seeing Parmesan still alert, still watching the windows. After getting some sleep at home, my mom phoned the non-emergency line for the police and reported what happened. They never got back to her after that, but apparently the woman she spoke to said they might wish to in the future, as he matched the description given of a suspect wanted in relation to a murder charge. No idea if he was actually that guy or just a random psycho, as I said. They never got back to her. We never went camping at that beach again. My parents sold the tent at a garage sale the following summer, and we started taking our vacations at proper campsites with security and other people around. Sometimes I drive past the turnoff to that beach road, and I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for other families to make the same mistake we did. So what's the takeaway then? For me, it's that I love my dog. Parmesan's still with us now, getting gray around the muzzle but still as protective as ever. I don't know why she did what she did that day. I couldn't tell you what her thought process was. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was love, or maybe she just really didn't like the way that man smelled of alcohol and violence. What I do know is that she saved our lives that night. The police later told us that there had been 3 unsolved disappearances in that area over the previous 2 years, all campers, all at that same beach. They never found any bodies, but they did find some personal effects washed up on the shore several miles down the coast. The detective who finally contacted us months later said they thought the killer had been using the bridge as a trap. It was the only way in or out of the beach area, making it easy to isolate potential victims. Parmesan changed after that night. She became even more protective, especially when we're in isolated places. She doesn't like it when strangers approach us after dark, and she always positions herself between us and any potential threat. The vet says this is common in dogs who've been in violent situations. They develop an even stronger protective instinct toward their family. About 6 months after the incident, we got an unexpected visit from 2 detectives. They showed us photographs of 3 different men and asked if we could identify our attacker. The pictures were mugshots, all of men with similar features, tall, thin, with that hollow-eyed look that comes from long-term drug use. None of them was our attacker, though. The man who had threatened us was broader, more muscular, despite his obvious intoxication. The detective seemed disappointed but not surprised. They told us that they'd been investigating a series of incidents along the coast, stretching back almost 5 years. It wasn't just our beach. Similar attacks had occurred at other isolated camping spots, always following the same pattern. A lone man would appear after dark, sometimes pretending to be security or a ranger, other times just openly aggressive. Most potential victims had managed to escape, but 3 groups hadn't been so lucky. The detectives wouldn't give us details, but they hinted that what they'd found suggested the killer kept his victims alive for some time before. Well, they didn't finish that sentence, and I didn't ask them to. The incident changed all of us in different ways. My sister stopped sleeping with her window open, even during the hottest summer nights. Mom finally left Dad the following year. I think seeing him freeze up during the confrontation made her realize he wasn't the protector she'd always imagined him to be. Dad threw himself even deeper into his work, as if trying to forget that night had ever happened. As for me, I developed a strange mix of fear and fascination with isolated places. I still love nature, still feel drawn to remote beaches and wilderness areas, but I never go alone. Parmesan is always with me, and I carry a satellite phone and personal alarm. Some might call it paranoia, but I call it learning from experience. It's been years now, and Parmesan's getting old. She moves a little slower, sleeps a little more, but her eyes are still sharp, and her protective instinct is as strong as ever. Sometimes when we're walking in the park and she spots someone acting erratically or aggressively, I see that same tension in her body that I saw that night on the beach. It's a reminder that while she may be a loving family pet most of the time, there's still a fierce protector underneath the gray fur and gentle demeanor. Last summer I saw a news article that made my blood run cold. A body had been found buried in the dunes near our old camping beach. The article didn't give many details, but it mentioned that the remains were at least 10 years old. The police were treating it as a cold case, possibly linked to several unsolved disappearances from the early 2010s. I called the police department and left a message about our experience, but they never called back. I guess our story was just one of many similar reports they'd received over the years. Sometimes I wonder if they ever caught him, or if he's still out there, circling lonely beaches in his car, looking for vulnerable families like we were. Looking back, there were so many warning signs we ignored that night. The empty beach that was usually full of campers, the car circling repeatedly before approaching, the fact that no other boats were anchored offshore. We were so used to feeling safe there, so comfortable with our routine, that we missed all the red flags until it was almost too late. I've learned to trust my instincts since then, and more importantly, to trust Parmesan's instincts. Dogs can sense things about people that we might miss, pick up on subtle cues that our human brains overlook. That night on the beach taught me that sometimes the difference between safety and tragedy can be as simple as paying attention to those warnings, whether they come from our own gut feelings or from the raised hackles of a loyal dog. These days I still go camping, but never at unofficial sites. I stick to established campgrounds with good security and plenty of other people around. Parmesan comes with me, of course. She may be older now, but she still performs a perimeter check of our campsite every night before settling down to sleep. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is right, I think I can still hear the sound of tires on that old bridge, still feel the terror of being trapped on that beach with a madman. But then I feel Parmesan's solid warmth against my leg, see her alert eyes scanning the darkness, and I know that as long as she's with me, I'm safe. The world can be a dangerous place, full of hidden threats and people who mean us harm, but it's also full of protectors, some of them walking on 4 legs instead of 2. I don't know how many more years I'll have with Parmesan, but I know that every day with her is a gift, a reminder of the night she proved that sometimes the fiercest guardian angels come with fur and a wagging tail. The beach is different now. They've installed security cameras and regular patrols. The old bridge has been replaced with a new one, wider and better lit. But I'll never forget that spring night in 2011 when we learned just how dangerous paradise could be and how lucky we were to have our own guardian angel watching over us. The relentless Arizona sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the desert bathed in an eerie twilight. I found myself driving down a lonely stretch of highway, the landscape around me a sea of scrub brush and towering saguaro cacti. My destination was a small ranch on the outskirts of the Navajo Nation, where I'd been hired to help with some maintenance work. As I drove, the radio crackled with static, occasionally catching snippets of local stations. One particular broadcast caught my attention, a somber-voiced announcer speaking in Navajo. Though I couldn't understand the words, the tone sent a chill down my spine. I switched off the radio, preferring the silence to the ominous broadcast. The darkness deepened as I turned onto a dirt road, my headlights cutting through the gloom. In the distance, I could make out the faint outline of mountains against the star-studded sky. The isolation was palpable, pressing in on me from all sides. After what seemed like hours, I finally spotted the weathered wooden sign marking the entrance to the ranch. As I pulled up to the main house, an old pickup truck rumbled to a stop beside me. A grizzled man in his 60s climbed out, his face etched with deep lines that spoke of a lifetime under the harsh desert sun. "You must be the new hand," he said, his voice gravelly. "Name's Duncan. Welcome to the edge of nowhere." I introduced myself, shaking his calloused hand. Duncan gave me a quick tour of the property, pointing out the bunkhouse where I'd be staying and running through my duties for the coming weeks. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle in the brush made me jump. Duncan must have noticed my unease. "First time in these parts?" he asked, a knowing look in his eyes. I nodded, embarrassed by my jumpiness. "Is it that obvious?" He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "The desert has a way of getting under your skin, especially at night. You'll get used to it, or you won't." With that cryptic statement, he bid me good night and headed back to the main house. I made my way to the bunkhouse, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that had settled over me. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. The unfamiliar sounds of the desert night kept me on edge, the mournful howl of coyotes, the rustle of wind through the creosote bushes, and other, less identifiable noises that set my imagination racing. Just as I was finally drifting off, a blood-curdling scream shattered the night. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. It came again, closer this time, a sound that was almost but not quite human. I scrambled out of bed and peered out the window. The moonlight cast long shadows across the yard, and for a moment I thought I saw something move at the edge of the corral. A trick of the light, surely. But then I saw it again. A dark figure, hunched and misshapen, slinking between the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as the figure turned, and for a split second I swore I saw eyes gleaming in the darkness, eyes that reflected the moonlight like a predator's. Then it was gone, vanishing into the night as if it had never been there at all. I must have made some sound of distress because moments later there was a pounding on the bunkhouse door. I opened it to find Duncan standing there, shotgun in hand, his eyes scanning the darkness behind me. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. I nodded, unable to find my voice. Duncan's face grew grim. "Come with me. There's something you need to know." He led me back to the main house where we sat at his kitchen table. Duncan poured us each a generous measure of whiskey, and as the fiery liquid burned its way down my throat, he began to speak. "What you saw out there, it wasn't natural. The Navajo have a name for it, skinwalker, a witch that can take the form of animals, or something in between man and beast. Most folks think it's just stories, but out here we know better." I listened, my skepticism warring with what I'd seen with my own eyes. Duncan went on to explain the history of the land, how it had been the site of ancient battles and dark rituals. He spoke of other ranch hands who had fled in the night, of livestock found mutilated in ways that defied explanation. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Duncan's eyes met mine, and I saw a mixture of determination and fear in them. "Because you're here now, and once you've seen it, you're part of this. The Skinwalker, it knows you've seen it. It'll be watching you now." A chill ran down my spine at his words. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and leave right then, to drive until this God-forsaken place was nothing but a bad memory in my rearview mirror. But something held me back. A sense of obligation, perhaps, or a morbid curiosity to uncover the truth behind these legends. The next few days passed in a haze of nervous tension. I threw myself into my work, repairing fences and tending to the livestock. Duncan kept a watchful eye on me, always nearby with his shotgun close at hand. At night I lay awake, straining my ears for any sound out of the ordinary. Sometimes I thought I heard whispers on the wind, words in a language I didn't understand. Other times I caught glimpses of movement just at the edge of my vision, gone when I turned to look. It was on the 5th night that things came to a head. I was out checking on the horses. They'd been skittish all day, refusing to graze in the far pasture. As I approached the barn, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the same inhuman scream I'd heard that first night. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I knew I couldn't leave the horses. Swallowing my fear, I edged closer to the barn door, my flashlight beam wavering in my shaking hand. The interior of the barn was pitch black, the darkness seeming to swallow my feeble light. I could hear the horses whinnying in distress, stamping their hooves against the stalls. And then, from the shadows at the back of the barn, I saw them. 2 gleaming eyes, reflecting my flashlight with an unnatural reddish glow. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The figure emerged from the darkness, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It was as Duncan had described. Not quite human, not quite animal. Its body was covered in matted fur, its face a twisted parody of a coyote's muzzle. But its eyes were terribly, unmistakably human. The Skinwalker let out another bone-chilling cry, and I turned to run. But I'd only taken a few steps when I felt something grab my ankle, sending me crashing to the ground. I rolled onto my back, kicking frantically as the creature loomed over me. Just as I thought it was all over, a deafening boom split the air. The Skinwalker reeled back, howling in pain and fury. Duncan stood in the barn doorway, his shotgun smoking. "Run!" he shouted, pumping the shotgun for another round. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I could hear the sounds of struggle behind me, punctuated by more gunshots and those terrible, inhuman screams. I made it to the house, slamming the door behind me and fumbling for the locks. For what seemed like an eternity, I huddled there, listening to the chaos outside. And then, suddenly, silence fell. It was dawn before I dared to venture out. I found Duncan sitting on the porch, his shotgun across his knees. He looked exhausted with a nasty gash across his forehead, but he was alive. Is it over?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Duncan shook his head slowly. "It's never over." "Not really. We drove it off for now, but it'll be back. It always comes back." In that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. I could leave, try to forget everything I'd seen and experienced, or I could stay, help Duncan defend this land against a threat most people would never believe existed. As the sun rose over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, I made my decision. This place, this fight, it was part of me now. For better or worse, I was in it for the long haul. The years that followed were a constant struggle. We fortified the ranch using a combination of modern security measures and ancient Navajo protective rituals. I learned everything I could about skinwalkers and other creatures that lurked in the shadows of the desert night. There were more encounters over the years, each one leaving its mark on us. We lost good horses, good men, but we held our ground, becoming the guardians of a secret war that raged just beyond the edges of the modern world. Now, as I sit on that same porch, my own shotgun across my knees, I think back to that first terrifying night. The young man I was then seems like a stranger to me now. I've seen things that would break most people, faced horrors that defy explanation, but I've also found a purpose, a calling greater than myself. The sun is setting, painting the desert in shades of purple and red. Soon the night will come, bringing with it the ancient terrors that have always lurked in the darkness. But we'll be ready. We'll stand our ground, as we always have. For we are the watchers on the threshold, the guardians of the boundary between the world of man and the realm of nightmares. And as long as we draw breath, we'll continue to protect this land and its people from the darkness that lurks just beyond the firelight. It was the summer of 2010, and I was 18 years old, living in a small border town in Arizona. As a high school senior on the cusp of graduation, I was filled with excitement about my future. I had enlisted to join the Army that summer, eager to serve my country and embark on a new chapter in my life. But before all that, I had to navigate the final weeks of high school and my part-time job at the local movie theater. Our family had moved into our current home about 2 years prior. It was a modest house, nothing extraordinary, but it was home. Being the oldest of my siblings, I had the privilege of having my own room. It wasn't much, but it was my space. My bed was positioned next to the door, with a TV sitting opposite, in front of a large window that looked out onto the street. The window was covered with long, white vertical blinds, the kind that sway gently at the slightest breeze. Life was pretty normal back then. I worked nights and weekends at the movie theater, and like any teenager, I enjoyed hanging out with my friends after work or on my days off. We weren't troublemakers by any means, just kids making memories before we all went our separate ways after graduation. This often meant late nights, which didn't exactly align with my school schedule. My dad, bless him, took it upon himself to make sure I got up for school each morning, often resorting to knocking incessantly on my door or even sprinkling water on my face. I hated it at the time, but looking back, I'm grateful for his persistence. It was during one of these late nights that things began to change. I was tossing and turning in bed, struggling to fall asleep, when I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. My closet door, which I distinctly remembered closing before bed, was slowly creeping open. It wasn't dramatic or noisy, just a slight, almost imperceptible movement. I brushed it off, figuring I must not have closed it properly. As I continued to lie there, trying to will myself to sleep, I felt a light tap on my right foot's big toe. It was so faint that at first, I thought I had imagined it. I sat up, peering around the darkened room, half expecting to see one of my brothers playing a prank. But the room was empty, and my door was still locked, as it always was. I got up, turned on the lights, and did a thorough check of my room and closet. Nothing. Shaking my head, I crawled back into bed, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. The next morning, I confronted my brothers, asking if they had been in my room during the night. They all denied it, looking genuinely confused by my accusation. I warned them to stay out of my room, but deep down, I knew they were telling the truth. They knew better than to invade my personal space. That night, I made sure to double-check everything before bed. I locked my door, ensured my closet was securely shut, and even did a quick sweep of the room to make sure my brothers hadn't somehow snuck in. Satisfied, I settled in to watch some TV before sleep. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of my TV turning off. The sudden silence was jarring. I got up, turned on the lights, and switched the TV back on, puzzled but not overly concerned. However, later that night, it happened again. The familiar click of the old box TV shutting off pulled me from my sleep. This time, when I opened my eyes, I saw my closet door standing ajar once more. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the house was settling, causing the door to swing open. Maybe there was a problem with the TV's timer. But deep down, I knew these explanations didn't add up. Frustrated and a little scared, I tried to go back to sleep. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, lying flat on my back, eyes wide open in the darkness. That's when I felt it again, a tap on my big toe. I kicked out, trying to catch whoever or whatever was there, but my foot met only empty air. Heart pounding, I leapt out of bed and ran to my brother's room. They were all fast asleep, exactly where they should be. There was no way they could have been in my room. I returned to my room, thoroughly checking every nook and cranny once again. Nothing. Exhausted and confused, I finally fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I woke to find my closet open yet again. The early morning sunlight was filtering through the blinds, and I noticed something I hadn't before. One or two of the blinds were swaying gently back and forth. There was no breeze, no open window to explain this movement. I felt a knot form in the pit of my stomach. When I saw my mom that morning, she immediately noticed something was off. She commented on how tired I looked, pointing out the dark circles under my eyes. I hesitated for a moment before confiding in her about the strange occurrences, the tapping on my foot, the TV turning off, and the constantly opening closet door. She gave me an odd look, caught between concern and disbelief. She suggested that maybe I shouldn't be watching TV so late, and told my brothers to stop messing with me if it was them. But I could tell by the look in her eyes that she sensed there was more to the story. That night, determined to get some proper rest, I decided not to turn on the TV. I was exhausted and fell asleep quickly. But my relief was short-lived. In the middle of the night, I felt something on my foot again. I tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away. But then I felt the blanket being gently lifted by my toes. It wasn't painful, but it was deliberate, as if something was trying to get my attention. This happened 3 times in quick succession. I kicked out, shouting in frustration and fear. I turned on the lights, my heart racing, struggling to catch my breath. The room was empty, but the closet door was cracked open once again. Tears of frustration welled up in my eyes. Was I going crazy? Was I imagining all of this? I tried to sleep with the lights on, but the heat became unbearable, forcing me to uncover myself. Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. When morning came, I confided in my mom again. The concern on her face was evident, but she seemed at a loss for what to do. In an attempt to help, she asked one of my brothers to sleep in my room with me that night. Despite my earlier frustration with them, I was secretly relieved at the prospect of having someone else in the room. That night, my brother set up a makeshift bed on the floor. When he asked what was going on, I snapped at him, telling him to mind his own business. I regret that now. He was only trying to help, and I was too proud and scared to admit how frightened I really was. I woke up in the middle of the night to an unsettling silence. Looking down, I realized my brother was gone. No blankets, no pillows. He must have returned to his own room. I couldn't blame him, especially after how I'd treated him. As I lay there, eyes closed, trying to will myself back to sleep, I heard a familiar click followed by static. My eyes snapped open to see the TV had turned on by itself. The room was bathed in the flickering blue light of the screen. As I sat up, my gaze was drawn to the window, where one of the blinds was swaying slowly back and forth. The fear and frustration of the past few days finally overwhelmed me. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, my voice cracking as I whispered, "What is going on?" I was trying desperately not to cry out or panic, not wanting to wake my family. What happened next is something I've struggled to explain ever since. It sounds crazy, even to my own ears, but I swear it's true. As I sat there on my bed, I saw an old lady standing by my closet. The sight of her froze me solid. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. It felt like time itself had stopped. She appeared to be in her late 60s or early 70s, short in stature with long black hair that fell to her elbows. She wore a long white nightgown and was slightly hunched over. Her features were indistinct. I couldn't make out her face clearly. She wasn't transparent like you might expect a ghost to be, but she wasn't entirely solid either. Her skin had an odd quality to it, not decayed, but definitely not normal. Then the most inexplicable thing happened. We began to communicate. It wasn't a verbal conversation, it was more like a telepathic connection. I found myself asking her, "What do you want from me?" Her response came not in words, but in a feeling, a thought that formed in my mind. "I'm scared. I don't know where I am." I asked her why she was talking to me, and again the answer came as a thought. "I'm waiting for my son. He hasn't come to visit me. I have been waiting for him." Confused and terrified, I asked once more, "Why me?" Her response sent a chill through me. "My son is the oldest, and I talk to you because you are the oldest." The next thing I remember is blinking, the world seeming to move in slow motion. I looked towards the window and saw the blinds swaying gently as the first light of dawn began to filter through. As if coming out of a trance, I suddenly found myself able to move again. I started to cry, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I ran to my parents' room, woke my mom, and told her everything that had happened. To my surprise, she didn't dismiss my story or tell me I was imagining things. Instead, she said it was a spirit that had come to tell me something. I explained in detail what I had seen and what the old lady had said to me. It was a Saturday morning, and I was supposed to stay at a friend's house for the weekend. Despite what had happened, I decided to go, partly because I had already promised, and partly because I was desperate to get out of that house for a while. When I returned home on Sunday, my mom was waiting for me with a candle. She instructed me to pray for the spirit to go where she needed to go, to pray for her path back to where she belonged. My mom also advised me that if the spirit bothered me again, I should ask her to leave, explaining that this wasn't her house and she couldn't stay. I lit the candle next to my room and prayed as my mom had instructed. It made me feel a bit better, like I was taking some kind of action against this inexplicable situation. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Between my late work hours at the movie theater and preparing for high school graduation, I didn't have much time to dwell on what had happened. The incident seemed to have stopped, and I began to wonder if it had all been a product of stress and lack of sleep. Then one day my mom sat me down for a talk. She explained that she had been intrigued by something I had told her about the old lady and had decided to do some investigating. She had managed to contact the previous owners of our house. What she discovered sent chills down my spine. According to the previous owners, before we moved in, there had been a family living in the house, specifically a mother and daughter. The mother had occupied what was now my room. She had chosen it because it was closest to the bathroom, and she needed a walker to get around. Tragically, the mother had fallen ill and been taken to the hospital, where she passed away. The most chilling detail of all? My mom told me that the mother had indeed been waiting for her son to visit her, but she had died before he had the chance to come. By this point, my entire family had heard the story. Most of them were skeptical, dismissing it as an overactive imagination or a series of coincidences. But my mom argued in my defense, pointing out that there was no way I could have known those details, especially about the woman having an eldest son. In the years since, many family members have asked me about La Viejita, the old lady, and my experiences. More often than not, I've changed the subject or simply refused to engage. I think they see it as an amusing ghost story, something to be shared over drinks or at family gatherings. But for me, it was anything but amusing. It was terrifying, confusing, and life-changing. To this day, I'm still scared when I think about what happened to me. This is the first time I've really spoken about it in detail since it occurred. I'm not sure I'll ever fully understand what happened in that room, why that spirit chose to communicate with me, or what it all means. But I do know that it changed the way I view the world. and the possibilities that exist beyond what we can see and touch. As I've grown older, I've come to appreciate the support my mom gave me during that time. While others doubted or dismissed my experiences, she listened, she believed, and she tried to help. Her acceptance and guidance were a lifeline during a time when I felt lost and afraid. I still think about the old lady sometimes, wondering if she ever found the peace she was looking for. I hope that wherever she is now, she's no longer waiting, no longer lost and confused, and while part of me hopes I never experience anything like that again. In the sprawling corridors of my old middle school, there was one door that stood out from all the rest. It wasn't its appearance that made it unique. It was a standard, institutional-grade metal door, painted the same dull beige as every other door in the building. What set it apart was the fact that it was always locked. Not once in all my years at that school did I ever see it open. The door was a source of endless fascination and speculation among the students. Rumors about what lay behind it spread like wildfire through the hallways. Some said it led to an abandoned military bunker, a relic from the Cold War era when every public building was required to have a fallout shelter. Others whispered about a torture chamber, where misbehaving students were sent to face unspeakable punishments. And then there were the more mundane theories, my least favorite being that it was just another janitor's closet, filled with mops and cleaning supplies. But regardless of what we believed was behind it, one thing was certain. Whenever I walked past that door, I was overcome by an eerie feeling that I couldn't explain. It was as if the air around it was charged with some kind of invisible energy, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The sensation would come as quickly as it disappeared, leaving me wondering if I had imagined it. As the end of my last year in middle school approached, I had all but forgotten about the mysterious door. The excitement of graduation and the promise of high school had pushed it to the back of my mind. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was preparing to head home after the final bell. The hallways were a chaos of slamming lockers and chattering students, everyone eager to escape the confines of the school. I was making my way towards the exit when I passed by that familiar door. Something was different this time. The eerie feeling that had always accompanied my encounters with the door was absent. Curious, I turned my eyes towards it, examining it more closely than I ever had before. That's when I saw it. A slight opening, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. My heart began to race. After all these years, the door was finally ajar. I glanced around, making sure no one was watching, and then made a split-second decision. I knew my mom wouldn't mind if I wasn't home right after school. I often went to a friend's house to play video games. This was my chance to finally unravel the mystery that had plagued us for so long. I waited until the hallway was clear, then slipped through the opening. The door closed behind me with a soft click, plunging me into total darkness. I fumbled for my phone, cursing under my breath when I saw it was only at 10% battery. Beggars can't be choosers, I thought, as I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light revealed a sight that took my breath away. Instead of a classroom or a storage closet, I found myself at the top of a steep staircase. The steps were carved from medieval stone bricks, as were the walls surrounding them. It looked like something out of a fantasy movie, completely at odds with the modern school building I had just left. Curiosity overwhelmed any sense of caution I might have had. I began to descend the stairs, the light from my phone casting eerie shadows on the ancient stonework. With each step, that familiar feeling of unease returned, growing stronger the further down I went. I was about halfway down when I heard a loud bang echo through the stairwell. It sounded like it came from above me, perhaps the door closing. I paused for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, but then continued my descent. In hindsight, I wish I had paid more attention to that sound. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the bottom of the stairs. I checked my phone. 15 minutes had passed and my battery was down to 5%. The staircase had led me to a long tunnel, lined with unlit torches. At the far end I could make out a wooden door. In the corner of the tunnel I spotted a light switch. With my phone now at 4%, I decided to conserve its battery. I turned off the flashlight and flipped the switch. To my amazement, the torches along the walls burst into life, bathing the tunnel in a warm, flickering light. As I walked through the tunnel, the feeling of unease that had been building since I entered the stairwell began to fade. By the time I reached the wooden door at the end, it had disappeared entirely. I placed my hand on the rough wood, taking a deep breath before slowly pushing it open. The room beyond was dark, much darker than the tunnel. I could barely make out a pedestal in the center and something on the floor. Before I could investigate further, I heard footsteps approaching. Panicking, I slipped inside and quietly closed the door behind me, then ran to hide behind what I thought was a large piece of furniture in the darkness. From my hiding spot, I could now see that the something on the floor was some kind of writing. It looked like it had been done in red paint, forming symbols and patterns that reminded me of the cult documentaries I'd watched late at night when I couldn't sleep. The door creaked open and two robed figures entered the room. One was dragging a long black garbage bag, while the other carried what looked like an ancient book. The one with the bag dropped it unceremoniously on the floor and disappeared into the darkness of the room. The other placed the book on the pedestal and called out, "You got the table yet?" "Almost," came the reply from the darkness. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A pale hand was poking out of the garbage bag. My mind raced with horrifying possibilities. Was it a prop for some kind of sick game, or was it real? Fear gripped me, and I knew I had to get out of there. I covered my mouth to muffle my panicked breathing and waited for an opportunity to escape. When the figure by the pedestal seemed distracted, I began to inch towards the door. I was mere feet away from freedom when a hand clamped down on my shoulder. "So there was someone in here after all," said a raspy voice behind me. "I guess so," replied the other figure, his tone unnervingly calm. "What are you going to do to me?" I cried, struggling against the iron grip that held me. The figure by the pedestal let out a chilling laugh. "It's not us you need to worry about," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "It's them." Suddenly the room was flooded with light, revealing a scene straight out of my worst nightmares. Standing on either side of me were two pale humanoid creatures, each at least 7 feet tall. They had no eyes, no ears, just an impossibly wide, malicious smile and a crooked nose. Their limbs were too long, too thin, bending at unnatural angles. The robed figure released me and joined his companion, leaving me face to face with these monstrosities. I tried to run, to scream, to do anything. But my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed with fear, rooted to the spot as the creatures began to approach me. As they drew closer, a horrifying realization dawned on me. The furniture I had been hiding behind wasn't furniture at all. It had been one of these creatures, standing perfectly still in the darkness. One of the beings stretched out a hand towards me, its fingers unnaturally long and tipped with razor-sharp claws. As it was about to touch me, something in my mind snapped. The paralysis broke, and I bolted for the door. I tore through the tunnel, my feet barely touching the ground. Behind me, I could hear the creatures in pursuit, their movements making a sickening, skittering sound against the stone floor. I reached the stairs and began to climb, taking them 2 at a time in my desperation to escape. Halfway up, an ear-piercing screech echoed through the stairwell. The sound was like nothing I had ever heard before, a mixture of nails on a chalkboard and the wail of a dying animal. It spurred me on, giving me a burst of energy I didn't know I possessed. I finally reached the top of the stairs, only to find the door closed. With mounting horror, I realized that the bang I had heard earlier must have been the door shutting behind me. I pounded on it with all my might, screaming for help, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, I could hear the creatures getting closer, their screeches growing louder. I was trapped, cornered like an animal. Just as I was about to give up hope, the door suddenly swung open. Without hesitation, I hurled myself through the opening, slamming it shut behind me. Panting and shaking, I looked around to thank whoever had saved me. But the hallway was empty. There was no one there. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen at the school. Staff members and students started to disappear. The police were called in to investigate, and they eventually opened that mysterious door. But when they searched the room beyond, they found nothing. No tunnel, no stairs, no creatures. The only thing there was a letter on a pedestal bearing 5 chilling words: "We will find you, kid." Later, it was revealed that the door could only be opened from the outside. This revelation only deepened the mystery of my escape. How had the door opened when there was no one there to open it for me? Years have passed since that day, but the memory of what I saw behind that door has never left me. Lately, I've begun to fear that the creatures have made good on their promise. For the past week, I've been sleeping with a 6-inch knife under my pillow. Every night I see them, those pale, eyeless faces, hunched over my bed with their malicious grins. I don't know how much longer I have before they come for me, but I won't go without a fight. Whatever happens, I need people to know the truth about what lurks behind that locked door in my old middle school. If you're reading this, be careful. And whatever you do, don't let your curiosity get the better of you. Some doors are meant to stay locked. I never really bought into all that paranormal stuff. My name's Otis Drexel, and I've been working in the missing persons unit for a good chunk of my life, 23 years to be exact. My job is to find people who seem to have vanished off the face of the earth. Most times it's just folks getting lost, having accidents, or sadly deciding to disappear on their own. But this one case, it still doesn't sit right with me. It was a Friday, I think, May 15th, 2022, the kind of spring morning where the air still has a bite to it, reminding you that summer isn't quite ready to take over yet. I was at my desk, sipping my 3rd cup of coffee and reviewing some case files when my phone rang. "Drexel," I answered, my voice still gravelly from lack of sleep. "Detective Drexel, this is Ranger Johnson from Great Smoky Mountains National Park. We've got a situation here that might require your expertise." I sat up straighter, my interest piqued. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park was a popular spot, but also vast and wild enough to swallow a person whole. We'd had our fair share of cases there over the years. "What's the situation, Ranger?" "We've got a missing camper, Rachel Pollard, 28 years old. Her boyfriend reported her missing early this morning. Says they had a fight last night and she stormed off. When he went looking for her hours later, there was no trace." I jotted down the details in my notebook, my mind already racing through the possibilities. "Any signs of foul play?" "None that we can see, but we haven't done a thorough search yet. The boyfriend seems pretty shaken up." I glanced at my watch. 10:46 a.m. "All right, I'm on my way. Keep the boyfriend there and don't let anyone contaminate the scene." I hung up, grabbed my jacket and headed out. As I drove towards the park, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a golden hue over the dense trees and rolling hills. The air was crisp with that unique smell of pine and earth you only get in places like this. It was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease settling in my gut. I arrived at the park ranger station just after noon. Ranger Johnson met me at the entrance, a tall, weathered man with a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated. "Detective Drexel," he greeted me with a firm handshake. "Thanks for coming so quickly. The boyfriend's inside. Name's Mark Henson. He's pretty worked up." I nodded, following Johnson into the station. In the small waiting area sat a scrawny guy with a guilty look on his face. He was pale and jittery, which wasn't unusual for someone whose loved one was missing. But something about his demeanor set off alarm bells in my head. "Mr. Henson?" I approached him, flashing my badge. "I'm Detective Otis Drexel. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Rachel's disappearance." Mark looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. "Yeah, okay. Whatever helps find her." I sat down across from him, pulling out my notebook. "Walk me through what happened last night. You said you had an argument?" Mark nodded, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Yeah, we've been having some problems lately. Rachel's been distant, you know. Last night I confronted her about it. Things got heated." "What time was this?" "Around 9 p.m., I think. We just finished dinner at our campsite." I jotted this down. "And then what happened?" Mark's voice trembled slightly as he continued. "We argued, yeah, she was really upset. She said she needed space, and then she just walked into the woods. I thought she'd cool off and come back, but she didn't. I looked for hours, but it's like she just disappeared." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Anyone else around? Anything unusual you noticed?" Mark shook his head. "Just us. We didn't see anyone. Our campsite is pretty isolated." "What was Rachel wearing when she left?" Jeans, hiking boots, and a red fleece jacket. She had her phone with her, but it's going straight to voicemail now." I made a note of the description. "And you waited until this morning to report her missing?" Mark's eyes darted away from mine. I thought she'd come back. I kept looking for her all night. When she didn't show up by dawn, I hiked back to get help." Something about his story didn't quite add up, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I'd seen enough cases to know that the person closest to the victim is often involved, but I'd also seen enough to know that sometimes terrible things just happen. "All right, Mr. Henson. We're going to do everything we can to find Rachel. I need you to stay here at the station in case we have any more questions. Can you do that?" He nodded, looking relieved to be done with the interview for now. I stepped outside with Ranger Johnson, the cool air a welcome relief after the stuffy interior of the station. "What do you think?" Johnson asked, his eyes scanning the tree line as if Rachel might suddenly appear. "Hard to say at this point," I replied. "His story seems shaky, but that could just be stress. We need to get a search team out there ASAP. The first 48 hours are crucial in these cases." Johnson nodded. "I've already called in some extra rangers. We can be ready to go in 30 minutes. "Good. Let's get moving." As we prepared for the search, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something. Little did I know this case was about to take me down a path I never expected, one that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. The search team assembled quickly, a mix of park rangers, local law enforcement, and volunteers. I went over the map with them, marking out the area where Rachel was last seen. Her campsite was located in a less frequented part of the park, about a 2-hour hike from the nearest road. "Remember," I addressed the group, "we're looking for any signs of Rachel Pollard. Clothing, personal items, tracks, anything out of the ordinary. If you find something, don't touch it. Mark the location and radio it in immediately." We spread out, each team taking a different section of the search grid. I paired up with Ranger Johnson, heading towards the area where Mark claimed Rachel had walked off. You'd be amazed at how quickly a person can vanish in the wilderness. The dense foliage and winding trails make it a real maze. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the canopy above grew thicker, casting long shadows across our path. "How often do you get missing persons cases out here?" I asked Johnson as we carefully scanned the ground for any signs of disturbance. "More often than we'd like," he replied, his voice low. "Most of the time, it's just hikers who've gotten turned around. We find them within a day or two, dehydrated and scared, but alive." "And the other times?" Johnson's face darkened. "Sometimes we don't find them at all. The forest, it can be unforgiving." We continued in silence after that, the weight of his words hanging in the air between us. Hours passed, and we found nothing. No footprints, no discarded items, nothing to indicate Rachel had ever been there. As the afternoon wore on, I met up with 2 other rangers, Ted and Lisa, who had been searching a particularly thick part of the forest. Anything? I asked, hoping for a lead. Nothing, Otis, Lisa replied, wiping sweat from her brow. It's like she vanished into thin air. We decided to take a break and regroup. The woods were silent, almost unnaturally so. It's something you get used to in my line of work, but it doesn't mean it's not unsettling. The stillness can play tricks on your mind. As we sat there, catching our breath and comparing notes, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. But there was never anything there, just trees and shadows. We should head back soon, Johnson said, checking his watch. It'll be dark in a couple of hours. I nodded, but I was reluctant to give up. Something about this case had gotten under my skin. Let's do one more sweep. There's a small trail over there that we haven't checked yet. The others agreed, and we set off towards the narrow path I'd spotted. It was overgrown and looked like it hadn't been used in years. Something about it drew me in. As we made our way down the trail, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the fading sunlight. The air grew cooler, and the silence more pronounced. It felt like stepping into another world. We were about half a mile in when I saw something strange. A clearing up ahead, bathed in an eerie light that seemed out of place in the dense forest. I held up a hand, signaling the others to stop. "Do you see that?" I whispered, pointing towards the unnatural glow. Johnson squinted, then nodded. "What the hell is that?" Carefully, we approached the edge of the clearing. What I saw there made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, ancient-looking and covered in moss. And in the middle of that circle... "Oh my God!" Lisa gasped. There, sprawled out in the center of the stone circle, was Rachel Pollard. Her eyes were open but lifeless, her body unnaturally twisted. There were no signs of struggle, no visible injuries. She was just dead. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. As I knelt beside her to check for any signs of life, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. Just the trees and the silence. "Damn it," I muttered, my nerves on edge. I reached for my radio to call it in, but as I did, I noticed something clutched in Rachel's hand. It was a small, smooth stone, unlike any I'd seen in the area. There was something etched into its surface, but I couldn't make it out in the fading light. As I pocketed the stone, intending to examine it more closely later, the feeling of being watched intensified. I couldn't shake the sense that something was out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The forest had revealed one secret, but it was holding on to many more. And as the sun set on that first day of the investigation, I had no idea how deep this rabbit hole would go, or how it would change everything I thought I knew about the world. We secured the area and began the process of documenting the scene. As we worked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking just out of sight, but there was never anything there, just the endless expanse of trees and the growing darkness. The medical examiner arrived about an hour later, looking as unsettled as the rest of us. Dr. Maria Suarez, a seasoned professional I'd worked with on numerous cases, knelt beside Rachel's body, her face a mask of concentration. "What do you think, Doc?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up at me, her brow furrowed. "I can't say for certain without a full autopsy, but there's no apparent cause of death. No marks, no wounds, nothing. It's as if she just stopped living." A chill ran down my spine at her words. In all my years on the job, I'd never encountered anything like this. We were packing up to leave when Ted called out, "Otis, over here, you need to see this." I walked over to where he was standing, just outside the clearing. There, partially hidden under a fallen tree, was another body. This one was older, much older. The clothes were tattered and the remains skeletal. This just keeps getting better, I said, sarcasm masking my unease. The discovery of the second body changed everything. It wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was something much darker. We called in more teams, and soon the area was swarming with personnel. The skeletal remains were carefully excavated and sent to the lab for analysis. As night fell, the park took on an even more sinister tone. The rangers set up a perimeter and we camped out, unwilling to leave the scene unattended. I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with questions and theories. What had happened to Rachel? And what about the old remains? It didn't make sense. People don't just die for no reason. Around midnight, as I sat by the campfire, I heard a low, almost inaudible hum. It seemed to come from all around us, reverberating through the trees. I looked at Ted and Lisa, but they were deep in conversation, oblivious to the sound. I stood up, my flashlight in hand, and walked towards the edge of the clearing. The hum grew louder, more insistent. I shone the light into the woods, half expecting to see something watching me, but there was nothing. "Everything okay, Otis?" Johnson's voice made me jump. "Yeah, just thought I heard something," I replied, trying to sound casual. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the feeling of unease never left. By morning, we were all eager to get back to the main station and report our findings. As we packed up, I remembered the strange stone I'd found in Rachel's hand. I pulled it out of my pocket, turning it over in the morning light. The etching was clearer now, but I still couldn't make sense of it. It looked like some kind of symbol, ancient and worn. "Hey, Ted, take a look at this," I called out. He walked over, squinting at the stone. "What do you think it is?" "No idea, but it feels out of place," I said, pocketing the stone again. "Let's get it back to the lab. See if they can make anything of it." We made our way back to the park's main office, the events of the past day weighing heavily on us. Rachel's body was taken to the morgue, and the skeletal remains were sent for further analysis. I handed the stone over to our forensics team, hoping it would provide some answers. As I sat down to write up my preliminary report, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just scratching the surface of something much bigger. The forest had given up 2 of its secrets, but I had a sinking feeling there were many more to uncover. Little did I know, this case was about to take me down a rabbit hole of ancient mysteries and unspeakable horrors. The Great Smoky Mountains held secrets that defied explanation, and I was about to come face to face with something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. Days turned into weeks, and the case only grew stranger. The medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death for Rachel. Her body showed no signs of trauma, no evidence of drug use, nothing to explain why a healthy 28-year-old woman would suddenly drop dead in the middle of the forest. The skeletal remains were identified as belonging to a hiker who had gone missing over a decade ago. His case had gone cold, written off as another unfortunate soul lost to the wilderness. But now, finding him in the same spot as Rachel, it seemed like too much of a coincidence. And then there was the stone. Our forensics team couldn't make heads or tails of it. It wasn't from any local geology, and the markings didn't match any known language or symbols. It was as if it had appeared out of thin air, just like our victims had vanished. I spent countless hours poring over old case files, looking for any connections. And then I found it, a series of disappearances dating back decades, all in the same area of the park. All unsolved, all with no trace of the missing persons ever found. One night, as I was going over the files for what felt like the 100th time, my phone rang. It was Lisa, one of the rangers who had been with me when we found Rachel. "Otis," her voice was shaky, "you need to come to the park, now." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my coat and drove out to the park, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, Lisa was waiting for me, her face pale in the harsh glare of the parking lot lights. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just follow me," she said, leading me into the woods. We walked in silence, the darkness pressing in around us. The familiar hum I'd heard that first night seemed to grow louder with each step. Lisa led me to the same clearing where we'd found Rachel. In the center was another circle of stones, and in the middle, another body. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. The body was that of a man, his face contorted in a look of sheer terror. He was dressed in hiking gear, and from the looks of it, he hadn't been dead long. "We found him this morning," Lisa said quietly. "No ID, no belongings, just dead." I knelt beside the body, examining it closely. There were no visible injuries, just like Rachel. But this time there was something different. In the man's hand was a piece of paper, tightly clenched. I pried it loose, my hands trembling. The paper was old and worn, but the writing was clear. It was a map with the clearing marked in red, and beneath it a single word: beware. I stood up, my mind reeling. What the hell was going on? I looked around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the trees and the silence. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We made our way back to the main office, the weight of the new discovery heavy on our shoulders. I handed the map over to the forensics team, hoping it would provide some answers. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The new body was identified as another missing hiker, his case also long cold. The map was examined, but it didn't match any known trails or landmarks. It was as if it was drawn by someone who knew the forest intimately, but not in any official capacity. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something beyond our understanding, something ancient and malevolent. The stone, the bodies, the map, they were all pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. It was during a late-night research session that I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. An old journal buried deep in the park's archives, written by one of the original surveyors of the area in the late 1800s. The journal spoke of strange occurrences in the forest, unexplained disappearances, eerie sounds, and most disturbingly, a clearing with a circle of stones that seemed to appear and disappear at will. The surveyor wrote of a local Cherokee legend about a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a place where dark spirits could cross over and take the unwary. The description matched our clearing perfectly. I knew then that we were dealing with something beyond the realm of normal police work, but I also knew that I couldn't just walk away. Too many people had vanished, too many families were left without answers. I gathered a team of trusted colleagues, including Ted and Lisa, and we set out for the clearing once more. This time we were prepared, or so we thought. We had cameras, recording equipment, and enough supplies to last days. As we entered the clearing, the air grew heavy with tension. We set up our equipment, documenting everything meticulously. Hours passed and nothing happened. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. And then, just as the sun began to set, we heard it. The low hum, growing louder and more insistent. We looked around, but there was nothing, just the trees and the darkness closing in. Suddenly, the ground beneath us began to tremble. The stones in the circle glowed with an eerie light, casting strange shadows on the trees. And then, in the center of the circle, a figure appeared. It was tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It moved with an eerie grace, its limbs long and thin. It looked at us and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand and the ground beneath us began to crack. We stumbled back, trying to keep our footing. "Otis, what do we do?" Lisa shouted, her voice filled with fear. "We need to get out of here now," I yelled, grabbing her arm. We ran, the ground cracking and shaking beneath us. The hum grew louder, almost deafening. I glanced back and saw the figure watching us, its eyes glowing brighter. We burst out of the clearing and into the forest, the ground still trembling. We didn't stop running until we reached the main office, our hearts pounding and our minds reeling. We reported everything, but no one believed us. The footage we recorded was mysteriously corrupted. The maps we found were dismissed as hoaxes. It was as if the forest itself was hiding the truth. Rachel's case remained unsolved, her death a mystery. The old remains and the new body were buried, their stories forgotten. But I knew there was something in those woods, something ancient and malevolent. In the months that followed, I tried to move on, to focus on other cases. But the events of that day haunted me. The forest had taken something from me, something I couldn't get back. I still have the stone, a small, smooth reminder of the unknown. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that low, insistent hum echoing through the silence. The Great Smoky Mountains keep their secrets well. But for those who know where to look, the signs are there. A warning to the curious, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. As for me, I've learned to live with the uncertainty, with the knowledge that there are things in this world that defy explanation. But I can't help but wonder, as I look out at the distant mountains, how many more souls the forest will claim before its hunger is satisfied.